Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to you all to this webinar on how to perform at virtual interviews. My name's Bart, and I'm going to be your host today, and the webinar that you're about to participate in is provided by FJ Wilson Talent Services, who are a talent acquisition and development service. The guidance that you're about to hear today is based on FJ Wilson's experience of recruiting for mid to senior level professional roles. So with us today to guide us through the topic of good virtual interview performance is Fiona Wilson, who is the Managing Director of FJ Wilson. So welcome, Fiona.
Oh, thanks, Bart. I love doing webinars with you. I'm very excited about today.
Excellent. So am I. This is great. It's lovely to have you with us today. So thank you to our audience for registering and for attending. It's great to have you with us today. A little bit of information about how this webinar will work. So during this webinar, we're going to give you 4 sets of suggestions. Each one of these sets of suggestions consists of a recorded clip that we'll play to you. After each set of suggestions, there'll be time for live question and answers with Fiona. So as questions occur to you, please do drop them into the chat that's on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Now, this chat is blind, so that if you ask a question, nobody else is going to see it. The only person who sees it is me, and I will then convey that to Fiona. And as and when I do that, rest assured, I'm not going to read out anybody's names, just in case anybody's got anonymity concerns. So if we get a lot of questions, which we hope we do, then we'll have to perform a bit of triage. So in advance, please don't take offence if we don't get time to answer your question, but we will endeavour to do our best. So let's move on to the first topic on this webinar, which is all around hardware and how to use it.
Is decide which device you're actually... So number 1 is decide which device you're actually going to use and test it. Test the camera, test the microphone. With regards to the microphone, a good tip is to use a voice recording app, which often is commonplace now on laptops and other devices, and then listen back for any distortion or echoes. You can consider using headphones with a built-in microphone to improve audio quality. The second tip is around also having a backup device. It's not ideal to obviously switch to a phone or a tablet, but having that backup plan is a very good idea. The second is around ensuring you're actually comfortable with the device. Often, for example, Teams is something that you're used to on a company laptop and it may feel unfamiliar on your own device. So just check out and play around and make sure you're comfortable with the device that you're actually using. The third is around consider having a wired connection. That can really help with slight drop-offs in Wi-Fi connection. And the fourth is around if you're using a wireless mouse, perhaps having things like spare batteries available, or of course, make sure it's fully charged. And to that point, obviously make sure that whatever device you're using is fully charged or plugged in.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for those bits of advice, Fiona. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think the topic of contingency is a really useful one, isn't it? Because so many things can go wrong unexpectedly, and it can really jar the flow that you might be in an interview, especially in an interview situation. So what are your thoughts on backup plans? What have you found that works well?
I think the key thing here in our sort of humble experience of debriefing pretty much every day with candidates and hiring managers is that most of our candidates have the best of intentions, but actually don't go through due diligence in preparation for virtual interviews. And it isn't the most thrilling of topics, but oh my goodness, it can really lead to people not progressing between or beyond what's typically the first stage because they get flustered. So our advice is to take the time to actually have a backup plan. It's fairly common for most people to have their own personal laptop, for example, or they can get their hands on one, or obviously an Apple sort of a MacBook, but also being able to download Teams if that's the platform on your phone. And we were chatting before, Bart, and you mentioned a very good point, which I'd forgotten. you can actually have, if you've downloaded Teams onto both your phone and your personal laptop, it running concurrently. So if something does go awry with the main machine, you can literally switch. So I think it's just super important to have that, and to make sure on a basic level you've got charging devices for both. For example, we had an example recently of a candidate who was out on first interview, very senior, 6-figure role, and they'd failed to mention to us as the agency that they were actually sort of abroad at the time and didn't have a laptop with them. So they chose to do what was quite a big first stage interview on their phone, and it just didn't work. And there was no backup, no contingency. It kept glitching and actually had to be abandoned after 15 minutes or so. And luckily for them, the panel could reconvene the next day. Otherwise, they'd have been a scratch at first stage. And actually, interestingly, that person went on to get the role, but it really put them off at first, at first stage. So yeah, having a backup plan is just vital.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. I mean, what about going old school as well? Because I mean, I remember, before pandemic hit and before video conferencing such as this became in effect the norm, people used to phone each other. I mean, is there room to actually convert or switch over to the backup plan being a telephone interview, for example?
Yeah, I think again that's like a really good point, and it's one which is very easy to overlook. So as part of our sort of standard process on an admin level, when we are organising first interviews over what is pretty much always a Teams platform, at that point we need to pass on, with permission of course, like the personal email address from us to the client so they can send the Teams invitation directly. It might be a really obvious point, but it's very easy to overlook the fact that you should also be providing the mobile number of the candidate at that point. And actually, interestingly, it is typically not asked for at all by the hiring manager, typically not asked for at all by the HR or the internal recruiter, if there is one. And it's very easy to overlook if you're dealing with a relatively inexperienced recruitment consultant, certainly sort of sub a year, because generally within a year they'd have been caught out at some point by that happening, and it would have corrected the action. So our advice is, as a candidate, to really think about also not being passive in this situation, and think about how you make sure that the recruiter, if there is one involved, passes that on. And likewise, if you're dealing directly with an employer, to make sure that they do have that if they haven't asked for it.
No,
so it's a really good point, Bart.
Interesting. Would you have any advice for how to, or whether it's even correct to approach people directly like that, saying, here's my backup plan, if it all goes wrong, let's reconvene on this number? I mean, for example, one could find people on LinkedIn or something like that and drop them a message there.
Absolutely.
What's your advice around that? Is that the thing to do or not?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable etiquette to do that. I think that if you are involved with an agency, the comms should be through the agency. If you are dealing directly, there are scenarios where, particularly with sort of larger corporate organisations, all your interaction pre-interview may well be automated, and therefore you can really worry in that scenario about how you're going to actually pass that information back if there's no platform to do it. So, for example, in that situation, again, your point is a great one around LinkedIn. Typically, most professionals will be on LinkedIn now, so it's easy-ish to find them on that, or an alternative, and just message them directly, introduce yourself and make it clear that you're doing that because there's no alternative if you can't work out their work email address, etc. But yeah, absolutely, take control of your own destiny, I think, in that situation.
Brilliant. And I guess if you've done that, you can satisfy yourself that you've demonstrated that you've done due diligence. And I guess if the role that's being recruited for requires people to be proactive and outward thinking, then that should hopefully reflect well as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easily overlooked. We screen the majority of our candidates over phone to start with to satisfy ED&I sort of note taking. But when candidates are shortlisted, if they haven't been before, we then meet them virtually. It's super easy to overlook giving people a phone number as a backup. So it's one of those simple things where it can all just go horribly wrong if the technology fails.
Yes, and seeing how flaky some technology can be, I can imagine that it probably fails slightly more often than one would like.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Some really interesting thoughts around that. So let's move on to a very much a related topic, which is all around the software that one uses for these virtual interviews.
Dated software, it can really lead to... When it comes to software, make sure that the video conferencing software operating system, there's a mouthful, and any other drivers are up to date. What we've learned over the years is that if you've got outdated software, it can really lead to compatibility issues, which you just don't want to be experiencing during or pre an interview. The second is around testing the software beforehand, doing a dry run with a friend or a family member and getting their feedback on both your audio and visual quality, and making sure, again, that you're familiar with that particular software is super important. And finally, do close any unnecessary apps and browsers and tabs to make sure that pop-ups are switched off and to minimise the risk of any technical glitches on the day.
Brilliant. Well, again, thank you very much indeed for that, Fiona. I think it's, again, a lot of the things, sometimes if one has time to think about it, are quite obvious, but I think in the heat of the moment and preparing for something when there's bound to be a little bit of nerves and a little bit of stress, I think these are all very, very, very useful things. So what things must go wrong? You must have seen examples of things going wrong in your role in a recruitment agency. So what happens when that happens? I mean, if a microphone freezes or a camera freezes or a signal goes or something else just collapses.
I think it's just super challenging, Bart, because there's not always the time within a recruitment timetable to repeat the exercise, and that's a challenge actually for both parties. Ultimately, I've never known an employer kind of double book a backup day in case the technology fails, for example, on the first sort of day or two. And likewise, with very busy working schedules, it's nigh on impossible for the candidate level that we operate at to find like a very quick, immediate alternative if this goes wrong. So our only suggestion is to really have gone through the due diligence beforehand. I think what often we hear is that people haven't done that because there is a growing familiarity with platforms like Teams for most sort of working practices, and that can lead in like a false sense of security. So you think, oh, I'll be absolutely fine, I'm used to working with Teams, and then what happens is also you're not used to using your personal machine for that particular purpose. And again, in a work environment, on a work machine, a work laptop, you're perhaps far more used to things like being updated, whereas on a personal machine, you may not actually have it running at that level. So, for example, last week we had a scenario where a candidate had downloaded Teams, tested it, but what they hadn't done is check for kind of any software updates. And what had happened on the day, unfortunately, on a Mac is that a software update had happened, but instead of clicking the message to update obviously later, they, in the stress of the moment, clicked update now, and it was a slow update, and it meant that then they couldn't actually log in, and they also hadn't got a backup device. So you know, in that sort of scenario, that's real life of what can go wrong. Again, in our experience, I mean, we deal with very lovely clients overall. People are very sympathetic to these situations. They know that it's not intentional, but again, they would expect certain things to have been taken into consideration by candidates. So things like, for example, particularly backdrops, lighting, orientation on the platform, that type of stuff. But it is definitely difficult. So our advice is just make sure you have done a dry run, and to your earlier point, do switch off things so you don't have emails pinging in the background, that type of thing.
Yeah, no, that's very, very sound advice, because I'm thinking back to one of the last places I worked in. The folk who maintained and ensured that computers worked and everything connected were sort of in the background and probably not appreciated as much as they were, because everything just seamlessly worked. And I think when you move to personal devices, suddenly maybe they're not updated, maybe they're not working, so maybe they're not actually that recent either.
Correct.
Maybe they're quite old.
Yeah, correct. And I think the thing is, again, if you're using your own, if you're using a work-based, we call them machines, the IT thing, work-based laptop, because you're using it on a regular basis, those checkpoints are in there all the time. And again, what we hear back is when people switch to using, say, Teams on their personal machine, they just haven't got that. So it all tends to be a little bit off, or they've forgotten to diffuse their background, or they haven't done an audio check. Or the updates are not correct. So you do need to run through that. I think it's a great point. You just don't you have to be your own IT support. And also you are controlling your own interview environment, where in person, it's the client who controls the interview environment, but you're co-responsible for your side.
No, absolutely. And I guess that extends slightly further out as well, because if I think to, for example, when I've been traveling, sometimes there was a reason when I may have needed to be online for various things. It didn't actually happen in the end, but I was noticing that the local mobile phone mast had periods when it was actually working really, really, really well, and periods when it just dropped out completely. And that sort of variability maybe isn't something in everybody's consciousness immediately, because usually there's somebody else managing that problem.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a really good point. It goes back to the earlier one around making sure that you're measured, making sure that you are taking responsibility for communicating a contingency plan. So again, an example which was happening yesterday, contract role moving very quickly, as is often the case with contract roles. But one of the candidates is currently abroad. Absolutely, of course, we prefer to wait to come back to be interviewed virtually. But what we did, of course, is flag in to the client that they're abroad, flag in the risk of that particular situation, make them aware that because they are on their phone, therefore they can't necessarily diffuse their background, etc., and also see if there is an alternative time date in case it just doesn't work, because you are really out of control in that situation. Although if someone's in a hotel situation, they can then of course potentially ask to use a room and do certain things. But again, Bart, it's all about onward communication to the future employer.
No, and surely there must be an element of credit that can be gained from that as well, because if a future employer is looking at it and going, oh, well, they've actually thought about this, they've got a backup plan, they've communicated well, brilliant. So they've ticked the contingency box, and that presumably looks quite good from your standpoint that you've done that.
Yeah, it's about identifying risk, isn't it, at a very basic level? Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely that. Brilliant. Okay, so during this, you mentioned surroundings, you mentioned lighting, and these are things that can go quite horribly wrong at times. And so that moves us very nicely into our next segment, which is all around backdrops, lighting, and interruptions. So let's see what advice Fiona's got for us there.
When it comes to surroundings, background is the first port of call. It's really looking at the camera, potentially taking a picture to make sure that you've avoided busy or distracting backgrounds. And of course, making sure absolutely that there's no personal, confidential information on show. A good tip is to consider, for example, a blurred background, which most devices have an option for. Second tip is around anticipating interruptions. Absolutely make sure that anyone else in the building or in your house is clear that they can't come in during your interview. And do make sure that any phones are turned off. If you still have a landline, which can easily be forgotten these days, do make sure it's unplugged or move it if you have one. And finally, lighting. in a virtual interview, facial expressions are most important. So check lighting and its effects beforehand. Avoid harsh shadows at all costs.
Brilliant. Again, thank you for that, Fiona. It's very good to have these tips articulated so clearly. So what specific advice would you have? I mean, you mentioned a big thing about on no account have no harsh shadows. What are the pros and cons here? Why is that such a no-no?
I think it's mainly around trying to build rapport in a virtual interview. We hear all the time from both candidates and also hiring managers around the need for candidates in a virtual setting to build rapport effectively. Again, but I suppose it goes back to the familiarity of using a company machine, a company device, where perhaps things are set up better. But in an interview, you are representing, of course, your own brand, and you are trying to effectively build chemistry and build relaxation as quickly as possible. So if, for example, you're in the north side of a building and it's super dark and it's autumnal winter time, the best thing you can do is try and find like it'll probably come up here through the diffusion, but like a little lamp, and just pop it on the base of the table, just to get an uplight on your face, so that when you are trying to be animated and positive, that the interviewers can see that. It's trying to imagine if you were interviewing an in-person setting and kind of sitting in the dark, you wouldn't necessarily be able to read things as well, and you want things to look as bright and cheerful as possible. Likewise, if you're in like a super light side of the house and you're on a rare super sunshiny day with too much light on your face, you could end up just being ghost-like, and the converse, but the same happens. It's again trying to make sure that the messages here, you're in control of your own interview environment, so you co-own that virtually with the future employer. And if you are applying for, of course, a hybrid role or a remote role, and also one especially that involves external engagement, employers are looking at you to whether you can build rapport effectively, whether you are actually taking responsibility for your environment, whether you will be a good brand ambassador. So if you get it wrong, that goes into their decision making.
Right, that's very interesting. No, that's very interesting about lighting, because of course body language is an incredibly important communicator, as well as the spoken word and the written word. And one of my gripes with electronic media is so often the nuances that are associated with body language and inflection tend to get quite badly scrubbed out. And so anything that one can do to make sure that that's minimized, that effect is minimized as much as possible, is a good thing.
Very good.
So again, in your experience, what sort of interviews do people actually prefer? Do they prefer the virtuals, or do they prefer the face-to-faces? I mean, what has the best sort of outcomes?
Yeah, so I think, again, because of the level that we deal at, which is, of course, more sort of the mid to the senior role, mid being defined as standalone specialists to first line managers, and above. We can only, I suppose, provide the feedback based on our world. So typically our clients do elect now to do first stage virtually, second stage in person, unless the role is fully remote, in which case first and or second, and very occasionally third, would be fully remote if it's a fully remote role. I think the world has changed pre-COVID. We were using virtual interviews to obviously meet and build up relationship and rapport with candidates, but our clients were really anti that in the main. They didn't use that technology. So I think as we kind of move into kind of 3 years plus post sort of the COVID acknowledgement and sort of initial pandemic, this is what the world is often moving to. It's more cost effective. It means less time for the candidate being taken out of busy diaries, and also it's more effective for bringing interview panelists together, particularly if they're geographically dispersed. So I think to part the first part of your question, our employers expect potential candidates to be able to build rapport over that as a mechanism, because they'll be using that mechanism for interacting with the wider team population as well as external stakeholders. So it's just commonplace, really, in our world. It won't be in all worlds, of course, but in our world it is.
That's really, really interesting. And it must also sort of stimulate the thought as to what do you think the difference is between the virtual world and the physical world? Is it purely just a matter of managing technical matters, or is there something else, a bit of a magic ingredient in there? Is there sort of human factors that differ between the two, do you think?
I think, again, it goes back to the point that's starting to run through as a thread. The big difference is that you become, as the candidate, co-responsible for the environment, whereas in person there's a slight passiveness, because the actual environment is decided upon, where the interview room facility, the structure, the seating, where people actually physically sit, all of that is decided by your potential employer, where it becomes actually equal in this situation. So both sides need to go into it really thinking about how it's going to work. Some hiring managers, particularly if they are large panels, quite struggle in that situation. If they're not used to interviewing together, they can all look a bit like, I don't know, university challenge in the old days with that ticker tape of people along the top, all rustling their notes, ready for the buzzer. I think it is tricky. I think it becomes trickier still if it's an interview mechanism for a role that actually is mostly in person, and therefore the candidates are also really not used to dealing with external stakeholders. But again, Bart, in our world, that would be unheard of, really. So I do think there's a difference. I mean, what we hear with our candidates is they do love the in-person round, but ultimately, if the chemistry and the rapport is there, alongside the role being right, that's easy to find at stage one, or as easy as it would be in person. If an interview panel is going to be closed and guarded, they would do that in person as they would do virtually. I don't think that actually changes, in my humble opinion.
That's really interesting. So interview situations by their very nature can be pretty stressful. And I think the stresses online and the stresses in person can be a bit different. So have you got any advice for managing nerves, especially if you're not really that comfortable with just talking at a screen or talking at a camera?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll come on to next about sort of tips about looking at the camera, kind of in the final topic. But I think on a generalized level, and we talk about this on our podcasts, which are available as candidate resources, but preparedness is absolutely vital, whatever medium you're involved in. And I think where the nerves kick in are, if you're well matched for a role, the nerves tend to kick in at the front end of the interview, when you can get asked very sort of simplistic questions, which do tend to split the pack quite early on. So, for example, if you are unable to answer at the right level, tell us what you know about us, why do you want to work here, what excites you about the role. I don't think that changes in terms of medium. We would advise people going into a in-person round to treat it a bit psychologically like a business meeting, to not like an old style driver's test where you've got nothing and you're being drilled in recall. We'd advise people to take in an A5 notebook with some anchor points, just as if they were meeting internally, a stakeholder or externally. So some anchor points around those very questions. Likewise, I think in a virtual setting, if you put your laptop, so you've got a wall behind it, you can of course put some points around it as memory reminders. So again, your face stays looking into your screen, but then your eyes might flick to punch home those simple answers to why do you want the role, tell us what you know about us, etc. I think that can help with the nerves. You've got to treat it in a way that is closest to a working environment, and that tends to not eradicate but disperse a lot of the nervousness.
Brilliant. I really like that idea of using the walls as well. I've now got this mental image of a wall full of post-it notes.
Horseshoe. Well, yeah, not
exactly. Fantastic. Brilliant. Some really, really interesting stuff there, Fiona. Thank you very much indeed. I think that links in very nicely to our final topic, which is all around the issue of personal presentation. So let's see what advice you've got for us there.
When it comes to the camera, looking at the camera when speaking really simulates eye contact. One tip is perhaps to put a little sticker by your camera lens, and that really helps to draw your attention during an interview or a virtual meeting to make sure that you're making eye contact. You can check that in advance by, again, looking at the camera angle, getting feedback by checking it out from a friend or family member, and positioning the camera angle itself so it's at an eye level or slightly above. And that will give you the most flattering angle, as well as presenting you in a confident and professional manner. And the second topic is perhaps when it comes to personal presentation is around dress. Appearance still matters in a virtual interview context. And so clothing choice really reflects your professionalism and respect for the process. It should be, for example, a professional top or shirt. Do avoid casual wear such as a hoodie or a t-shirt. And again, test your outfit by checking how the outfit looks in advance on the camera beforehand. We mentioned lighting previously, but do avoid shiny fabrics, as again, those can reflect light on the camera and distract.
Brilliant. Thank you again for that, Fiona. That's really very, very useful advice, and some stimulus for thought as well. I mean, in your roles as managing director of FJ Wilson, you must have seen some absolute howlers in the past when it comes to dress preparation. I mean, is it possible that you could share some of those with us as sort of reminders of things really what not to do, and then as a counterpoint, give us some examples of how perhaps the candidates in question might have done things a little differently and a little better?
Well, I think often candidates actually overlook the interaction with the recruiter actually as a starting point, depending on the relationship with the client and actually the service engagement. Recruiters can be making the decision actually who to shortlist for clients, or they're asked to produce a short long list. So short long list would be typically between 6 to 8 candidates. So the recruiter really is, out of relevant applications, making the decision based on various cues, and that can also include how professionally that candidate has approached the recruiter, and again how professional they have been in that interaction. So it's very easy, Bart, to be influenced in any context. I do think that I would actually impress on anyone sort of attending the webinar to take that interaction with the recruiter equally sort of seriously. So as a recruiter, when we meet candidates, notwithstanding we wouldn't be perhaps sort of grilling them, or they wouldn't necessarily have the level of nervousness around that situation they would do as if they were interviewing for an actual role. Sometimes you can meet candidates in a real state of disarray. So again, this week I met a candidate and we'd arranged to meet at kind of 5:30, and they kind of I've always got stuff to do, but it's very interesting. It's the people who kind of message you and say, oh, I'm just, can I rearrange? Or I message, or they just rock up late. So immediately, if someone's just rocking up late, like 8 or 9 minutes, you do start forming an opinion, and you start thinking, I don't know this person. Could this happen? Yeah, in a virtual situation with a client, or I don't know if it's actually any worse. Do you just devalue me as a supplier in the process? Because it should be about mutual respect. That we talk about that a lot in the world now, don't we? Mutual respect. So you will be processing those types of reactions. Likewise, in that particular scenario, the candidate who was late was quite didn't expect like people to be kind of really terribly sorry, but just like, oh sorry, I was actually just finishing my Ocado order. And you do just think, well, Again, that's not the best thing. There are examples of where you meet people and their backgrounds just haven't been thought about. So they're just incredibly, it doesn't matter if they're busy, because you can always talk about diffusion, but they're, for example, sitting perched on a bed, which can feel quite weird and unsettling to certain people. Or in the summer, people wearing sort of some very revealing clothing. So I think all of those judgments can really come into play, where you start actually thinking, do I need to actually start having a conversation about how you come across? And that can really affect your decision as a recruiter as to whether you want that person to represent your brand as a candidate going into that situation. So I think that's kind of number one. It shouldn't just be rolled out just for when you go on interview. I think it's per se having that greater awareness professionally about how you come across. So there are examples, and they do sometimes come back to haunt you as a recruiter, where you then hear feedback from a client around someone did X, someone did Y, there was underwear hanging around in the background, etc., etc. So I think it's just that level of measurement that you typically are looking for at all times, because we're also looking for people who are going to positively represent our brand and protect our brand reputation onwards to a client. So I think there's that sort of more broader point. As a recruiter, one of the tips that I mentioned in the recording was around having a little sticker. I've actually got one by the lens now, and it's really helpful, because naturally, like everyone else, I want to look at your picture, Bart. I don't want to actually look down the lens. So just having that sticker in a different colour just periodically draws my eye to that. So when I'm meeting clients, when I'm meeting candidates, when I'm doing this, it will at least remind me to try and look down it upon occasion. I think that becomes more pronounced in an interview situation, where you become more conscious about building effective rapport. When you switch internally, you perhaps get a little bit lazy about it, where people stop doing that because they feel comfortable. So I think that's one of the big takeaways. That's, I think, really helped candidates actually over the years in a virtual setting.
No, that's really interesting, because it is actually really hard to just look at the
hard,
especially if there's supporting material on visual real estate around it as well. I tend to find my eyes darting all over the place, and probably come across as I've got some horrendous tic. But no, I think that's really, really interesting. And I think if I was to try and summarize what you've said, not only in this segment but across all of it, a lot of what you said seems to come down to basically act professionally, and make sure that professionalism and professional courtesy extends throughout the entire process, as you hope it would, and also ensure that you've got a degree of situational awareness in terms of yourself, your surroundings, how you present. Interesting.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that. And I think that point around just remembering in a virtual setting that you co-own and are co-responsible for the professionalism of that situation is super critical. Absolutely, you'll be interviewed by people who are challenged in that scenario themselves. They don't enjoy it. They can find it difficult to build rapport. But your job as an interviewee is to make sure that you're making every effort, just as you would do, of course, in a professional scenario, to build that yourself. And that's what you just need to be committed to, I think, in the process.
Brilliant. So thank you. Very, very interesting set of segments. Very, very sound piece of advice. So thank you very much. We're almost at an end. So I'd like to ask you one last thing, and that's to outline a little bit more about what FJ Wilson Talent Services does. I'm aware that you provide services for employers, but also to individuals. So could you just give us a little bit more information, please, on how you can assist job seekers?
Yeah, so obviously some of the attendees today are perhaps not from our direct world. So the world in which we operate is we strategically focus on working on vacancies which come from awarding organisations, professional membership bodies and learning providers. We don't typically sort of work outside of that area at all strategically, because that is our focus. So that's kind of number one. On a candidate level, we have a range of resources that we continually invest in. So this is our second series of webinars, which we'll be making also on demand. We have a very consistent podcast that we have a lot of content on for both candidates as well as employers. So there's a whole range of episodes on there diving into how to use the annual report to research an employer effectively, how to operate in a virtual interview setting, presentations, etc. We have PDFs as resources, which you can access at our website, fjwilson.com. And we also offer executive coaching for mid to senior staff. So we do that on both presentations as well as on a sort of recruitment and a career basis. So there's a whole range of ways in which we support the more general candidate population.
That's absolutely brilliant. And presumably the webinars and the podcasts and so forth, the schedules can all be found on your website, which is fjwilson.com.
That's right. Fantastic. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Fiona. It's been a really stimulating chat, and I've really enjoyed the interaction and also the advice that you've given. Huge thank you to our audience for asking questions and for coming along today. And hopefully you found this a very useful session and had some advice there that you might find applicable to whatever role you might be applying for next. There's one other piece of thanks I'd like to give, and that's to a chap called Harry Chalmers, who is a composer who's sorted out all the music for us this session. So without further ado, thank you very much indeed, and I hope we see you again at a future webinar, and have a great rest of the day.